withstand sunrise.
Is that the same dam that the EPA was like talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The one that's like
So
could fail.
my
right?
route had to cross the lake. We took our own samples.
Oh, you took water samples?
Oh yeah.
Oh, from the wells?
We came up the river into this. It's called the far gut. We took it right below the outflow of their plant, their pond. What they're dumping in the river now. They have been dumping since the 1940s. These are the levels that we found. The levels of arsenic, chromium, and lead are above the levels allowed by the state and federal government.
That's the one that they said they're safe, right?
That they say are safe.
But these are above them? They're
Yep.
above the safe levels?
They're above the safe level.
Wow.
We sent
And what does arsenic do? What are the
Arsenic-
side effects of that?
arsenic,
Like the
all
long
kinds
term?
of long term. It's going to be neurological damage, nerve damage, skin problems, all kinds of things.
So the area is, it's like 50 people, like 50 different places of drinking water, right? Are they treating it for arsenic and chromium?
No.
and lead? No.
No.
But they're above the safe levels, right? The EPA
But
safe
yes,
levels.
they're above the safe levels for the federal government and for the state government.
And they're aware of that.
And they're aware.
And they're treating
They're going to give you a solid dams. Now, this right here, they're filing closure. They're basically already closed.
Yeah,
They've
it's
been
been
illegally hauling in fly ash from Southampton, Hopewell, and Mecklenburg
without a permit?
without a permit. That's why you just heard me ask him the question, is fly ash a solid waste? And you notice how he danced around his answer. That's why he isn't the right answer. Because if it is considered a solid waste, then they did so illegally in violation of all federal and state regulations for solid waste. They hauled this stuff in here under the DEQ permit. The DEQ permit is supposed to be for the discharge of industrial water. How can you haul in a solid under a water discharge permit? Because DEQ allowed it. Well, no, but the problem is DEQ is the problem, not the solution. Because it used to be that DEQ was funded by the general fund. Now the DEQ is funded by the permits and the fees of the very people they're supposed to be regulated. Definitely a conflict of interest.
What's nice talking to you? What's your name?
No problem. Bobbles.
Bobbles on?
Yep.
Nice to meet you.
You got a piece of paper? I'll give you my email address.
Sure.
Application speech with them later, and that way we know who they are and what their role is. From the Piedmont Regional Office, we have Emily Anderson, who is the Water and Planning Permit Manager. We have Joseph Ryan, who is the permit writer for this permit. And at the close of the meeting, they'll be taking questions pertaining to the development of the permit that we're going to be speaking about this evening. From our Valley Regional Office, we have Brandon Kiriko, who is the Water Compliance and Permitting Manager for that office, and Bev Carter, who is a water permit writer. And if you would like to talk to them about how things are going with the permittees compliance with their permit up at Gremo, they'll be here to take any questions from you about that facility. From our central office, we have Fred Cunningham, who manages the agency's water permit programs, and Alan Brokenbrough, who manages the agency's discharge permits. They'll be here to take questions from you pertaining to the general permit issuance process, anything pertaining to the Administrative Process Act, or the technical bases for how some of the effluent limits are calculated. And any questions that are pertaining to the Chesterfield Power Station that are not addressed by this permit action, or questions about any other Dominion permit facilities elsewhere in the state, will be directed to Bill Hayden, who is our Public Information Officer. Also with DEQ in the audience are Mr. Mike Murphy, who is the DEQ Regional Director for the Piedmont Office, And we have Rena Kalos, who is from our Public Information Office as well. At the end of this meeting, they and I will be walking around, and if you have questions and you're looking for the right person to answer your question, we'll be happy to find the person who is best able to satisfy your concerns. And with that in mind, we'll start with the presentation. Please note that the presentation that I'm giving this evening is on DEQ's website, so if I'm speaking too quickly and giving away my New York roots, you're more than welcome to read this at your leisure and process it at a slower pace. We also have the permit information, we have the permit, the fact sheet, and some other supporting documentation on our webpage. So if you have any questions about what's being discussed this evening, you'll have ample opportunity to read up on that. This evening we're going to be discussing some water quality concepts so that we're all speaking off the same page. When we talk about different terms that DEQ uses, I won't be able to completely eliminate the jargon, but I will try. We'll also give some background on the facility, and we'll talk about the permitting process. What is allowed in the current permit, what is going to be permitted in the proposed permit, and how some of these things are changing to reflect things that are going on at the site. Please note that while this permit addresses dewatering of the ash ponds, the ultimate disposition of the ash pond solid contents, and the long-term groundwater management are the subject of DEQ solid waste program permits and will not be addressed in this evening's information session. So talking about the water concepts, we'll talk about beneficial use, water quality criteria, federal effluent guidelines, water quality-based effluent limits, and we'll talk a little bit about what goes into a permit or the supporting documentation, which we refer to as the fact sheet. When we talk about beneficial uses for state waters, we're basically trying to answer the question, what is the water good for? And in the Code of Virginia, the General Assembly has outlined those uses very specifically. We have in-stream and off-stream beneficial uses. The in-stream uses include habitat protection, assimilation of waste, recreation, navigation, and cultural and aesthetic values. The off-stream uses include domestic use, including public water supply, agricultural use, electric power generation, commercial, and other industrial uses. The water quality criteria are established by the department and are approved by the Environmental Protection Administration to answer the question, what do the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the water have to have in order to support those beneficial uses that I described earlier? These are in the form of state regulations, which are established to support those beneficial uses and are reviewed every 3 years. They also incorporate federal regulation and state law, and they address multiple criteria: aquatic life, fish consumption, public water supplies where applicable, recreation, shellfishing, and wildlife. DEQ also has an ongoing program where we are monitoring the waters of the state to determine that the criteria that I just described are being met and that those beneficial uses for the various state waters are being supported. And we monitor the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of these different waters, whether they be streams, lakes, or estuaries. We assess these waters every 2 years, and we determine whether the waters support the designated uses. The waters that fail to support the designated beneficial uses are designated as impaired and are subject to further evaluation. That evaluation occurs with regard to pollution sources, whether man-made or naturally occurring, and the department develops what we refer to as a diet for those pollutants contributing to the impairment, and we call that a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. The implementation of the TMDL may include the imposition of more protective effluent limits on discharges within a given watershed where the impairment is determined to have occurred. In the years before we had a TMDL process, DEQ addressed water bodies receiving effluent from multiple dischargers by establishing water quality management plans. And a little bit different than a diet, these actually allocated or budgeted the waste streams from the dischargers so that you could have multiple facilities discharging into a given water body, and the cumulative effect of those discharges would not result in an impairment. Some of these water quality management plans are still in effect. Some of them have been modified in response to TMDLs that have been developed in those watersheds, such as the Chesterfield Bay Water Quality Management Plan in response to nutrient loads. When we take water quality criteria, we use those to develop VPDS, permit limits, by evaluating the flow volumes and pollutant concentrations discharged by the facility, We look at the water quality criteria, including TMDLs and water quality management plans that may have been developed for that water body, and we look at the present condition of the receiving stream. Limits are set to protect water quality in the stream under the worst possible combination of conditions. So we are typically looking at a discharge that is going to occur at the highest rate that is anticipated or has occurred by that facility. We are looking at the lowest possible in-stream flow, and we are looking at the highest possible concentration of pollutants that would be expected to occur without treatment. There's also a concept known as the Federal Effluent Guideline. The Clean Water Act of 1972 and its amendments established a minimal national standard for treatment of wastewater for a variety of industries in order to ensure an even playing field across the country. This prevents dischargers from simply finding a bigger stream to receive their wastewater. It doesn't matter whether a facility is discharged into a small pond or to the ocean. If they have a facility that is subject to federal effluent guidelines, there is a minimum treatment standard that is based on the activities going on at that facility that all these facilities must abide by. These guidelines do not account for local conditions. But for every discharge, DEQ staff evaluate the chemicals known or reasonably believed to be discharged by the facility that are subject to federal effluent guidelines, for which water quality criteria exist, or that are listed in the TMDL or Water Quality Management Plan. If a given chemical is subject to more than one of the above requirements, the more protective of the requirements will be applied. The rationale for effluent limit development is extensively documented in the permit fact sheet. And if you are reviewing the draft permit for this facility online, you'll find it consists of several parts. The cover page identifies facility and receiving streams, so you have an idea of who it is and where they're discharging, and it also dictates the time during which the permit is in effect. The permit also contains effluent limits and monitoring requirements. So for each point that the facility discharges, which we refer to as outfalls, it establishes limits for those pollutants that are known to be discharged and how often those pollutants are to be monitored. If the facility is getting a new limit for a given discharge and a given parameter, DEQ is authorized in some cases to authorize a schedule of compliance for that permittee so that they may develop a strategy to comply with that limit. And typically, if it's a water quality-based effluent limit, they have that permit term or a shorter period of time to develop that limit. If you read the permit for the Chesterfield Power Station, there are some federal effluent guidelines that impose new conditions that have not previously existed, and there are some schedules that go past the term of this permit, and that's authorized by the federal government and by the regulations that have been promulgated. The permit also contains other operating conditions which are intended to ensure compliance with the effluent limits, and these conditions also establish other controls and reporting requirements to protect water quality. The permit fact sheet is set up almost in parallel to the permit. First part of the fact sheet basically says who, what, where, when, and why as to the existence of this facility and why this permit action is being undertaken. You then see receiving stream information, which gives the characteristics of the receiving stream, some of the critical flows which may be involved, and it will also list whether there are any relevant impairments or TMDLs associated with this receiving stream. The fact sheet then characterizes the waste streams that are generated by this facility. How is wastewater generated by this site, and what does this wastewater reasonably expect to contain? The fact sheet also contains legal or technical rationales for the effluent limits and other permit conditions. It summarizes changes from the previous permit, if it's a reissuance of an existing permit. It summarizes comments from other state agencies, federal agencies, and the public. And there's a lot of supporting documentation. We have our calculations, we have our stream data, our effluent data, a number of other documents online. And in fact, the fact sheet for the Chesterfield Power Station permit is approximately 1,000 pages long. At this time, I'll take questions pertaining to the slides that I just presented to you. If you have any questions pertaining specifically to the Chesterfield Power Station, please hold those until the end of the presentation. Does anybody have a question about what I've just presented to you all? Yes, sir.
I think 2 slides back, you referred to the fact that there were some new federal limitations that will apply to this permit?
Yes, I'll explain those. Yes, ma'am.
It says for every discharge, DEQ staff evaluates the chemicals known or reasonably believed to be in a discharge. Does it list anywhere what all you guys will be monitoring for?
Absolutely. If you read the permit and fact sheet, The effluent limitation pages contain those requirements that pertain to specific outfalls. The agency also has other monitoring requirements that coincide with reissuance of the permit. There's also additional testing that's going to take place that pertains to some of the new treatment units that are coming in. And if you read through the fact sheet, you will see that the agency has basically gone through and analyzed a number of these parameters, the reason why we were interested in those parameters, and what sort of information we had to make our determinations.
So
like I said, the fact sheet's pretty comprehensive. 1,000 pages gives you a lot of information.
A lot. So all known toxins that are in coal ash are being monitored for?
All is a very big word, but if you look through the list on the fact sheet and you find one that we haven't checked for, you're more than welcome to provide that in public comment. We've gone through a very broad list of parameters that might reasonably be expected to be in this discharge, but if it's possible we've missed one, you're more than welcome to provide that to us, and we'll take a look into it. Yes, ma'am.
Are you guys testing any like the water around the area, or is it only on the property?
The state does have a monitoring program, and if you go out if you go on the agency webpage, you can actually get on a GIS app which identifies the monitoring stations, how long they've been in existence, and what sort of monitoring program those stations were established for. And if you have specific questions about any of those stations, you can feel free to contact our office or contact any of the names that are listed on that webpage. Yes, sir.
This may apply to the next section, but it's my understanding with a project, with a plant this old, that there may have been some previously unpermitted discharges. One, is that the case? And two, does this new permit encompass any previously unpermitted discharges?
That's probably a great question to cover once we're through the presentation, because some of your questions are going to be answered by the presentation and some of it's not. And it's entirely possible that after I finish this presentation, you may have new questions. How about if we cover those at the end? Yes, ma'am.
How do you know, clear back at the beginning, we talked about dewatering and as separate from the removal or disposition of the solid waste that was left behind. How do you know what is going to flow out and what is going to settle and be left?
We'll discuss some of that in the rest of the presentation. With regard to the solids disposition, that's something that you may want to talk to some of our land protection staff when the public information meetings about the closure response occurs. This meeting is talking strictly about the discharge permit, and I'll explain a little bit of, I'll go to some of your questions in part of my presentation. Yes, sir.
So the water is only, the water in the ash ponds is all that's tested, not removed?
No, we have an ambient monitoring program that does cover a number of stations, but the best answer I can give you on that is if you look at our agency webpage and you look at the GIS application, you'll know exactly where those stations are located, and if you have other specific questions pertaining to what was discovered at those stations, that would be a good opportunity to discuss that with us. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, I know this issue is coming up in different parts of the state, in different rivers. Do the permits take into account how dirty or clean a river is and adjust accordingly? Or
they do to some extent, but in the case of the James River, because of some of the things going on, we're basically looking to try to preserve the water quality by what's being discharged. And we can explain that to you a little bit later on, about how we set those limits. Ma'am?
What makes up the bulk of the fact sheet, and do you expect it to get longer by incorporating a response to comments after the public comment period?
That's going to add a little bit to it. The response to comments document will be separate. We'll provide a brief summary of it in the fact sheet, but the response to comments document will be an independent document that will be promulgated about the time the permit is reissued or voted upon by the board.
And what makes up the bulk of the 1,000 pages now?
What we have right now are a lot of sheets showing calculations demonstrating why for a given parameter or a given outfall an effluent limit is or is not necessary. You've also got the ambient data that we do have in the stream in the James River at various stations around there, so you can get some idea of what the effluent characteristics are. And you also have a summary of various chemicals that have been discharged through the different outfalls. So it's a very lengthy process. When we calculate a limit for a parameter at a facility in a district like Dominion, you're looking at quite a bit of data and having to get into a spreadsheet, and we run some statistical programs to determine whether the presence of a pollutant at that level, at the rate that is being discharged, it has the potential to cause a problem in the stream. Mr. Brokenborough and Mr. Cunningham would be happy to explain that to you after the meeting. We can go into a lot more detail, but I would like to keep this talk moving for the sake of people who are just interested in an overview. Yes, ma'am.
Do different sections of the river, again going back to the beginning of this, in water quality criteria, do different sections of the river have different standards based on whether one section is supposed to be clean enough for swimming, or clean enough to be a water intake, or clean enough for recreation or shellfishing?
If you were to look through our water quality criteria regulation, what you will find is that there are some general standards that apply statewide, and then we start looking at some other water quality standards pertaining to specific use. For example, if you're looking at a public water supply, you basically have to have a discharge within a certain amount of miles of a public water supply for those standards to take effect. If you were to look at water quality standards for something like the Chickahominy River, which basically goes into a reservoir that supplies drinking water to a lot of people, the water quality standards for the Chick and for all its tributaries are much more stringent than what you would find going into the tidal James. So rather than try to answer a specific question about discharge, if you look at the water quality standards, you will find that there are actually special standards that apply in different places. There are different standards that apply whether you're dealing with freshwater or saltwater, whether you've got swamp water influence, whether or not it's identified as a drinking water supply, whether or not you have shellfish identified. So all of those different things have to be accounted for by staff as we're developing these limits.
So in different sections below where the coal ash water is supposed to come out, different standards could apply.
That's possible. But again, you can verify that for yourself by reviewing the regulation. And some of that is also covered in the fact sheet. The permit fact sheet actually talks about any sort of water impairments in the area, and they also talk about special standards that may apply to that reach of the river. You got a question toward the back?
How does DEQ determine where the GIS monitoring stations are, and are citizens allowed to request for those to be in a certain location?
If we have monitoring stations in place, they should be available through our GIS profile or application. So you should be able to get online and look for stations that have existed and get an idea of what their purpose was. If you believe that DEQ should be using other stations, or if you're a member of a citizen monitoring group that would like to take over monitoring at a given point where we don't have a station already, there are DEQ staff who are manage those programs, and we can put you in contact with them. Yes, sir.
I'm curious, specifically the water coming out of the ponds, it doesn't much pressure recently. How do you monitor that? And isn't there a strict standard for that? One time, you put the water back in, it wasn't at least as clean as the water you were putting it into. That may be an old standard.
That's not that's. We've got a couple of different concepts. I don't want to throw a lot of jargon out. Typically, the discharge is intended to not cause any degradation of the water body that it's going into. And if you remember one of the first slides I had about beneficial uses, the General Assembly recognized that one of the beneficial uses is the assimilation of pollutants. For example, you've got Henrico, you've got Richmond, you've got Hopewell, you've got the Chesterfield county utilities. All of those discharge pollutants to state waters. And in some cases, if you look at the plume going into the receiving stream, you've actually got a clean plume of water going into a muddy river. That doesn't mean they're completely free of pollutants, but they are treated to a very high degree of quality. But if you look at the limits pages for the permit, what you'll find is that for the given activities that Dominion is proposing to undertake on site, every discharge is monitored, and every one of those limits is associated with some degree of analysis on the part of the state with either the federal effluent guideline, the water quality criterion, or both. And I'm going to get into some of the limits development as I go into the second part of the presentation, and that may answer a number of your questions. Does anyone else have any questions? Otherwise, I'll jump into the second part of the presentation. Ma'am?
I was just wondering, is DEQ doing any type of analysis on the watershed implications of all of these different permits across the state?
As part of our monitoring program, we start looking at what's in the background, and we can analyze for that. One of the things that sometimes gets lost in all this is that if we are developing water quality-based effluent limits for pollutant, if you've got any pollution whatsoever, the influence of that pollutant on the receiving stream goes to near zero within a very brief period of time. We're going to talk about some very large flows when we talk about this facility. But if you were to look at the City of Richmond wastewater plant, for example, when it discharges into the James, there are a couple of pollutants that may be present in that effluent, and within a couple hundred yards, you'd be hard pressed to find some of them. If you look at the nitrogen and the phosphorus that are in that effluent, the effects of those pollutants can be felt further downstream, which is why we have a nutrient trading program, and we have some fairly strict limits pertaining to the discharge of nutrients. Every discharge has a couple of different aspects. You have some things in that water where you have a very near field effect. It's either going to cause a problem or it's not. As some of the material in the wastewater breaks down going downstream, there may be some things that don't exert an effect on the water very close by, but a little bit further downstream, they may make their influence felt. You have some other ones that may not be felt until you're further downstream. We account for that through the water quality management plan, and we also account for that when we develop TMDL. Because a lot of our TMDLs are watershed-based, where we are looking at all these different inputs from facilities, and we try to make sure that the water quality is maintained in that receiving stream. Did that answer your question, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Just one quick one. Is there any affluent that's pumped into the Chesterfield treatment plant there adjacent to the plant?
There was not. Other than sanitary waste that is generated on site, the toilet flushing and the other domestic stuff? No, sir. All right, getting into a little bit of background on the facility. The applicant is Virginia Electric and Power Company, doing business as Dominion Virginia Power. The permit action is the reissuance of PA 0004146 Chesterfield Power Station. Electricity was first generated at this facility in 1945, and the current generation units provide about 1,750 megawatts. Units 1 through 6 were coal-fired. 1 and 2 have been replaced by units 7 and 8, and units 7 and 8 burn natural gas and distillate oil. As part of the burning of coal, we have what people are referring to as coal ash, or as EPA would refer to it as coal combustion residuals, or CCR. Historically, at this site, CCR was conveyed from the boilers to treatment or disposal units by wetting down the ash and sluicing the mixture through pipes to the lower ash pond that is located on site. And I'll have a facility map up in just a moment. This pond provided settling for the ash, and it also provided treatment for other waste streams that are generated by the facility. And some of you may be curious to know just how many different ways water is used at a steam electric power plant. And I'll explain some of those to you, and how they've been historically treated at the site and how they'll be treated in the future. Solids dredged from the lower ash pond were placed in the upper ash pond for further dewatering. EPA's CCR rule mandates the closure of ash ponds. The closure of these ponds and the conversion to a dry means of disposal of future CCR generated at this facility are the subjects of DEQ solid waste program permit actions and are not addressed by the permit we're discussing tonight. Please note that irrespective of the means of disposal of the CCR and the ash ponds, the process of dewatering the CCR as regulated under this draft permit would still be necessary. The draft permit addresses effluent monitoring and limits for the cooling water discharges, the ash pond operation, decanting and dewatering, and other waste streams on site, which we would generally refer to as low-volume wastes. Other requirements in the permit address the cooling water intake structure, stormwater, and continuation of existing groundwater monitoring. The draft permit does not address conversion of the coal ash ponds to solid waste storage facilities, nor does it address changes to the existing groundwater monitoring, corrective action, or risk assessment plans. And here we have a map of the facility, and if this pointer works, you can see the James River right here, and you can see where Farragut starts and comes around like this. I'll explain to you the different ways that water passes through this facility, and some of this will make more sense to you as we go along. But at the very start, up here in the James, you have outfalls 001 and 002, which are strictly cooling water discharges. They have been cooling water discharges, and they will remain cooling water discharges. You have several outfalls up here where you basically have backwash from your intake screens, and Dominion has provided a demonstration that it's no longer necessary to regulate those. They were using chlorine to disinfect those screens. They're no longer doing it. There's nothing, when you address the question of what's going back into the river, there's nothing going back in the river from those outfalls that wasn't taken out of the river, and we are discontinuing the requirement to monitor and limit pollutants at those because Dominion's not introducing anything anymore. You also have the bulk of the cooling water that runs through the facility go out this cooling channel, which is referred to as outfall 003, and it goes into the head of Farragut and works its way around under tidal conditions to go back into the main channel of the James River. You have the lower ash pond right here, as I'm indicating with the pointer, and outfall 004 represents the discharge from the lower ash pond, which has been occurring since the ash pond was installed in the 1960s. And as I said earlier, the solids are basically dredged out of this pond, and they're placed in what's called the upper ash pond for final disposition. And outfall 005 is where some of this water is decanted and currently is discharged. A couple of other uses of the water that we have on site. You can see over here, this is where they stockpile the coal. And stormwater runoff from the coal pile, along with some other stormwater on site that is industrial process-based, is going into outfall 004. The facility is also subject to what we call a general permit for discharges of stormwater impacted by industrial activity. And there are some outfalls on the site that are regulated under that general permit. But everything you see here that is potentially process-related is going to end up in outfall 004 under the last permit reissuance and at the very beginning of this current permit that is being proposed. You also have a pond over here, which is called the Metals Cleaning Pond, and let me explain to you what that means. If any of you have ever seen scale on a pot that you've had on a stove for a while, you know that almost no water is totally pure. You're going to have some impurities in water, and as you're running a huge amount of water through and boiling it, you end up with some mineral deposits on those boiler tubes. Dominion cleans those tubes by just simply hydrolancing them. They put high pressure water on them, and they don't use much in the way of chemicals. The water that actually goes into the chemical cleaning pond is what they call non-chemical cleaning wastewater. This is basically the residual from what happens when they hydrolance those boilers. That water is settled, there is some chemical treatment that is provided there, and that water is pumped over to outfall 004 as well in the lower ash pond. Some of their other low-volume chemical cleaning wastes and other activities receive some degree of treatment and end up in outfall 004 as well. And again, this is the way the plant is operating today, and if this permit is reissued, this is the way the permit will operate on the first day of that new permit term. And up on the slide right now, you will see the uses of water that are going to continue largely without interruption or change in the proposed permit. Outfall 001 is cooling water from units 7 and 8, which are the gas and oil-fired boilers. And you see about 212 million gallons a day is the maximum flow going through those cooling loops. Unit number 3 accounts for 89 million gallons and is out outfall 002. And units 4, 5, and 6 come up with about 750 million gallons per day and are discharged through that channel that I showed you earlier. Let me just show that again. 753 million gallons a day are flowing through that channel. The diagram I have up here may be a little bit hard to read, so I'll try to walk you through it. But what you're going to see is that there's a new treatment plant that is going to be constructed for the purpose of the decanting and dewatering of the lower and upper ash ponds. And the easiest way I can describe this to you before I show you any slides is that there's been an activity that's resulted in a discharge from outfall 004 for over 50 years. We propose to more strictly limit that discharge, we're going to reduce the volume, and then we're going to eliminate it altogether. You can see outfall 001, 002 remain the same. That new treatment plant that is going to treat the water that is being decanted out of these ponds is going to go through a new treatment plant similar to what is being developed for the Brino and Possum Point facilities. And we're designating that outfall 101 And that will be going out either outfall 001 or outfall 002. And I'll explain how we've calculated the limits for this. We are also looking at the coal pile runoff, we're looking at the metal spleen pond waste, and we're looking at a couple of other discharges that have been developed in response to Dominion's installation of air pollution control equipment. And those are going to be receiving separate treatment before going to a brand new treatment plant called the Low Volume Wastewater Treatment System, which we're designating as outfall 301. Again, I'll show you a little bit more information on this. But what I want to emphasize when we're looking at this diagram is that you have several sources of wastewater that have been identified that the new steam and electric power generation rule by the federal government has resulted in putting federal effluent guidelines on those activities. These facilities' internal outfalls will be subject to federal effluent guidelines. They will then be discharged to an internal treatment plant prior to discharge, and that internal treatment plant, outfall 301, will be subject to water quality-based effluent limits as well as federal effluent guidelines. So, in the history of this facility, what we're proposing in the permit is basically the most protected permit with regard to water quality that we have. Outfall 004 and outfall 005 will ultimately go away. And the uses of water that will be discontinued at the site, to summarize them briefly, are the storm water that lands on the ponds, the ash sluice water, and a couple of other small uses. Currently, those discharges may be up to 20 million gallons a day, but when they're treated and discharged under this permit, once the decanning operation begins, they will not exceed 5 million gallons per day. And as I said, when the decanning and dewatering process is complete, they will be eliminated altogether. Prior to drawdown, the activities that are currently conducted in the lower ash pond will continue, but they will be subject to newer and more protected water quality-based limits. I want to explain the difference between drawdown and dewatering, and I want to explain why those two things are different than closure. The drawdown is the treatment and discharge of the standing water in these ponds. The dewatering is the treatment and discharge of that water that is left after the decanning process is over, when Dominion is going to be removing the water trapped in the pores between the particles and the solids in the ponds. So this is, if you thought of it as, taking the solids and getting that last bit of water out before ultimate disposal, that's pretty much what you're looking at. During the drawdown, both the upper, I got that straight. Yep, I hadn't edited that. During the drawdown, both the lower and upper ash ponds are subject to water quality-based limits comparable to those imposed at the Bruno and Possum Point facilities. The parameters that were known to be present in CCR were evaluated. Minimal dilution, a 2-to-1 ratio of the effluent in the James River was assumed, and concentrations equal to the most protected water quality standard for the respective parameters were assumed present. The permittee will also be required to sample for most of these parameters 3 times weekly and to expedite laboratory analysis of these samples. We also have a number of conditions in the permit pertaining to the drawdown and dewatering activities. One thing I would like to emphasize here is that when we are talking about drawdown and dewatering, it is not synonymous with closure of the site. The drawdown and dewatering would be necessary whether the materials were disposed of in situ at the ponds with a cap, or if they were hauled off-site to be disposed of at another location. So no matter what we're doing, or what Dominion chooses to do with regard to the solids in those ponds, the decanning and the dewatering must take place in order to facilitate that. So these effluent limits will apply, Dominion will be installing additional treatment, and they will be strictly regulated. We also have a special condition which establishes treatment requirements for those discharges coming out of the ponds, and it also establishes monitoring and reporting requirements to ensure compliance with these. Additional treatment will be required once certain trigger thresholds, which are below the permit limits, are reached. So at some point below the permit limit, if they reach this trigger threshold, they will be required to install additional treatment to provide protection and ensure that they remain in compliance with the permit. If for some reason any discharge from outfall 101 during the drawdown and dewatering doesn't comply with the permit, they must cease the discharge as soon as the exceedance is discovered, and the permit established conditions that must be met before the discharge will be allowed to resume. The pond will also be drawn down no more quickly than 2 feet per day, and that requirement was developed for the Department of Conservation and Recreation Dam Safety Division to minimize the risk of dam stability issues during the drawdown. Now we'll talk about new or changed uses of water that are going to be going on at the site, and these are anticipated to occur through this permit term and on into the future should this permit be reissued. The lower and upper ash ponds will have what's called a tow drain, basically to draw off water and to ensure the stability of those pond berms. You have various low volume wastes that are generated on site, the lab waste, there could be some chemical cleaning waste. You have the non-chemical cleaning waste, which I described earlier. You've got a station car wash. The facility runs its own water treatment plant to be able to get the boiler water. You have stream backwash because unlike the discharge into Proctor's Creek actually sends some effluent over to the Dominion Power Station to use as makeup water in their air pollution control devices. Unit 6 has a flue gas desulfurization device, which basically knocks the sulfur dioxide out of the emissions. And you've got some runoff from that site, and you've also got some wastewater that's generated from that. You also have leachate that will occur resulting from the new landfill that is being proposed by Dominion. That will also be treated. And then you have a coal pile runoff. And if you look at this, what you can see is that each of these has a designation. Some of these are currently permitted or existed in 2004. You can see the designations for the outfalls as the facility is configured today. And then by the end of the permit term, what you're going to have is flue gas desulfurization, the metals cleaning, the leachate from the landfill, and the coal pile runoff will all be individually treated through maternal outfalls, which will then flow to the low volume wastewater treatment plant and receive additional treatment prior to discharge. This low volume wastewater treatment system is subject to water quality base limits, which were developed in a manner comparable to those discussed when we ash pond closure. Parameters known to be present in these waste streams were evaluated. Water quality criteria must be met at the point of discharge to Farragut without in-stream mixing. I'm going to jump a few slides back and I'll show you where this will end up. They have to ensure when they discharge this material from this new treatment works that right here at the end of the thermal channel, when that goes into Farragut proper, they have to be able to support all the water quality standards. We're not allowing any additional dilution by virtue of it being in Farragut.
So can you read points of that stream? Is it the main Farragut or is it the discharge of that?
You've got Farragut proper through here, and you've got that thermal channel, and it's actually, the 301 will actually go in, okay, it's right here from the channel. 301 will be going in right around here, so at the time you're going into Farragut with this discharge, right around here, you're going to be supporting water quality criteria. There is no allowance for mixing in the main body of Farragut once you start there. And again, the concentration is equal to the most protected water quality standards for the respective parameters were assumed to be present in that discharge. And as I said earlier, several of the waste streams going into the low volume wastewater treatment system will receive treatment prior to being discharged to it because they're subject to federal effluent guidelines. The permit also contains a number of conditions pertaining to this new treatment system. They'll have to notify us prior to commencement of discharge. The first day of discharge will be used as a trigger date for a number of other permit conditions. As I said, worst case concentrations were developed to conduct the analysis for this outfall, but in order to confirm the characterization of the effluent, the committee will be required to perform monitoring on that discharge and submit that data no later than 90 days following the commencement of discharge from that low volume treatment system. Going to one of the discussions that came up in our question and answer session, DEQ recognizes the size, complexity, and age of the infrastructure of this facility, and this permit contains a new requirement that Dominion perform a comprehensive investigation of the site to identify potential risks and prevent illicit or unauthorized discharges to state waters. So you understand a little bit better what is in this proposed permit, what happens next. As many of you are aware, the permit is currently subject to a public comment period. That comment period has been open for a few weeks. It will remain open until July 21st, 2016. 2 weeks from today, we will be holding another information session at 6 p.m., followed by a public hearing in which we will take testimony from citizens at 7 p.m. And again, it will be at the Thomasdale High School West Campus, 3900 West 100 Road, Chester, Virginia. And September 22nd and 23rd, 2016, the State Water Control Board will be voting on this permit whether to reissue it as it's been drafted by the staff, or reissue it with changes made in response to comments or other situations, or to deny the permit. And they'll be making that decision at the General Assembly building in September. Comments on this proposed permit action may be mailed or emailed to DEQ during the comment period. It is not necessary to appear at the hearing to submit a comment with the department. And if you come to the hearing, you may provide comments orally, in writing, or both. The comments should address the adequacy of the draft permit. If an objection to the permit is raised, please provide a technical or legal explanation for the objection. The reason why we ask this is there's a limit to our authority, and if you're asking us to do something with regard to this permit that we are not legally authorized to do, it's very uncomfortable for us to have to explain that to you when the permit's going to the state board. And this concludes our presentation. I appreciate y'all's patience and are getting started a little bit late. We will have staff available to answer questions in various locations in the auditorium. Mr. Brokenbrough and Mr. Cunningham will be taking general questions pertaining to the permit process and to the development of water quality-based limits over on this side of the auditorium, on the floor. Mr. Kirchhoff and Ms. Carver will be here over on the far side to take any questions you might have about their experience in drafting the Bremo permit and what steps the Dominion is taking to comply with that permit. Mrs. Adamson and Mr. Bryan will be here at the center of the floor to answer any questions you may have about this specific permit and how those conditions were derived. And that concludes the presentation. If you've got a question, come on down.